Yeah? All right, greetings, 10-9 warrior. Be thankful unto the mother, father, creative life force of the universe. Kudzai, Muzimu Makudo, give praises unto our great ancestors. Abibi Tumi, Abibi Fahodie, African power and African liberation for all African people. I'm just gonna give a brief Pan-African perspective on the issues regarding Palestine, Gaza, and Israel right about now. And I should start by saying I don't consider myself, an expert on the Palestine versus Israel conflict, but I am a Pan-Africanist and know enough, to be able to provide some of a Pan-African perspective. And as always, when it comes to issues such as these, the question becomes, to what extent should we as African people be involving ourselves in the conflict, taking sides, showing solidarity, and to whatever extent we should be showing solidarity, who should we be showing solidarity to? And let me do something that I've been neglecting to do over the last few weeks, and just say that in relation to what I've just said, there are many issues taking place in the African world right about now that we need to be concerned about. Recently, it was announced that President Ruto of Kenya is going to be sending a paramilitary force, police, army from Kenya to Haiti as funded by the American government. And there's going to be more to be said on that, but as African people, we need to be concerned about that, particularly because that agenda is a European imperialist, a Western imperialist agenda. Many brothers and sisters will know that recently coups have taken place in Mali, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso and Niger, and Gabon recently. And so we need to be concerned about and taking keen interest in the dynamics of all of those situations, And in that respect, tune into Gotkush TV, because at the end of Black History Month, we'll be doing 2 sessions, looking deeply.
On what you just said, though.
Yes.
Those coups was anti-European.
Anti-French, definitely, to a significant degree, but there's more to be said on that, because anti-French doesn't necessarily mean Pan-African and doesn't necessarily mean working on behalf of the masses of the people. And so it may be the case that in some instances that is the case. In other instances that may not be the case, wherever it may be the case, maybe we've got to see Wagwan for a little bit longer first before we start putting our faith in certain institutions, certain brothers and certain sisters. But we're going to be exploring the dynamics of all of those situations, on Gotkush TV at the end of this month, October, So do stay tuned to Gotkush TV. It's very important that we open a conversation like this in relation to many of the pertinent issues that are facing us as African people around the world, Now, having said that, I'm a Garveyite, I'm a black nationalist, Pan-Africanist. Garveyism, the philosophy of Garveyism, or the working idealism of Garveyism, is referred to as African fundamentalism or universal African nationalism, And within the framework of the Garvey movement, we see many examples of demonstrating and declaring solidarity with people around the world in their fight to be free, liberated, and establish nationhood for themselves, The Garvey movement extended solidarity to the people of India and the people of Ireland, and even the Jewish people in their quest, to establish a nation for themselves, And so there is nothing within that Pan-African framework that suggests that we are above demonstrating solidarity with people and recognizing where injustices have been faced by them and standing on principle and saying that where injustice exists, justice needs to occur. There's nothing wrong with that in principle. And so where injustice is, once again, justice needs to occur. And it takes nothing away from us as African people to stand on that principle and to declare justice for all people in the world. Having said that, there seems to be an imbalance, in these dynamics, whereby, as far as the Pan-African movement is concerned, in as much as I've said, the Garvey movement expressed sympathy and encouragement to the Jewish community in relation to establishing the state, yeah, a Jewish state, that particular sensibility shifted after the dynamics of mass European War II, when the state of Israel was established. And significantly, Panafricanists have stood in solidarity with the Palestinian people because of the fact that the establishment of the state of Israel happened and occurred within the context of the occupation of what was considered to be Palestinian land, and through the displacement and in many cases the murder of Palestinian people. Stick up in there, I'm going to come back to that point, okay? In relation to what we have seen over the past week, we have seen the world is split along who stands with Palestine and who stands with Israel. And we have seen a number of dynamics in relation to African people, prominent black people in the world, such as the Floyd Mayweather, such as LeBron James, and at least one other basketball player that I heard about, such as many politicians, yeah, in Britain and America. The Secretary of Defense, forget Lloyd Austin, I think his name is, in America is a black man. The head of AFRICOM is the US's Africa High Command, the military force that is designed to represent the interests of America on the African continent. The head of that institution is a black man as it stands today. We have politicians like David Lammy, the Labour MP, declaring, yes, unconditional support, yeah, for the state of Israel as it stands in today's world, yeah. On the other hand, you have a significant mass of activist black people who are standing in support of Palestine, yeah, who were on the streets of London yesterday, standing in support of Palestine, who have been marching in France and in many cities in the United States of America, sharing and expressing solidarity with the people of Palestine. As I have said, the most significant dynamic as far as solidarity in these instances in relation to African people is the fact that Africans have generally speaking stood in solidarity with Palestine. And as I've said, there's nothing wrong with doing that. But we'll be foolish to not identify the fact that when it comes to our solidarity with Palestine, the extent of that reciprocity in that relationship tends to end when we as African people begin to speak about the condition of Africans in the Arab world. When we begin to speak about Sudan and Libya and Mauritania and Morocco, when we begin to speak about the experience and the condition of African people in Saudi Arabia, yes, and in Yemen, and even in Iran and Iraq, when we begin to speak about the condition of African people in Gaza, little as it's known, there is something called Afro-Palestinians. And when you hear them speak, they speak about the discrimination that they experience, yes, at the hand of Arabs in Palestine. And so as African people, and as a Garveyite in particular, coming from a race-first analysis, it will be improper and very unstrategic for us to leave those voices out of the conversation. The Garveyite race-first analysis compels us to hear the voices of African people wherever we are and begin our analysis with what conditions our people in these environments face. By the same token, there are African people in Israel who are severely discriminated against by the Israeli state. We know very much about our brothers and sisters from Ethiopia who have faced things as extreme as forced sterilization, yes, in Israel. And that's just to name one of the dynamics that take place as far as this state of Israel is concerned, yeah? Now, another dynamic in this is the fact that many Africans live in the Western world. And we have to take note of the fact that as far as global geopolitics is concerned, the dominant power in today's world is the geopolitical West, yes? The political axis that is known as the West, coming out of and dedicated to the axis of Western Europe, yeah? And so we see a dynamic in which the West has given sanction to Israel based upon the idea that Israel has a right to defend itself. And they begin the conflict somehow with an atrocity that Hamas of Palestine committed a week ago. Somehow this becomes the point at which we begin the conversation, as though Israel is simply retaliating to an atrocity that was committed by Hamas, all right? Now, we are not sanctioning in this conversation at all the murder, the kidnapping, or any form of torture against innocent people. What we have to question as African people living in the West and subject to the dictates of Western hegemony, what our role is relative to the nation states in which we live, to the nation states that dominate the narrative that we are currently being indoctrinated into at this moment in time. We must be clear about the fact that the governments of America and Britain and France and the rest of the Western world have given and are giving Israel the sanction to commit war crimes, even by the definition that they have set within human rights law as upheld by the UN, or what they call international law. And let's explore this concept called international law for a second. This is why it's very important for us to know the history so that we can see our place in it as African people. International law, or what is called international law to a significant degree, was developed after Mass European War II, also known as World War II. Europeans went to war with each other, and because they had colonized the majority of the planet at that point, they dragged the rest of the world into the war and called it a world war. It was a European war. European tribes were warring against each other and dragged their colonial subjects into the process of that war. And so as a part of that Mass European War II dynamic, one of the things that took place, as we know, is the Holocaust against the Jews throughout Europe, but particularly in Germany. And so Europeans come out of that process, with the need to develop some frameworks to ensure that they themselves do not engage in that level of warfare again. And so we begin to hear talk about human rights and international law, and the United Nations is developed. And as a part of the United Nations, charters on human rights and rules, for the Geneva Convention, rules for engaging in warfare begin to develop. And all of this is called international law, okay? So when you hear that Israel should or should, the argument about whether Israel should or should not adhere to the dictates of international law, this is what they're referring to. What was the condition and the state of African people relative to these European powers who were engaging in this process at that time? We're talking about the period between 1945 and 1948. African nations in Africa and the Caribbean were still very much under colonization at this point. Remember that. African nations in the Caribbean and Africa were still very much under colonization at this point. What they begin to do is, because the rest of Europe stepped in to represent the interest of what the Jews had suffered in Germany during that time, the Jewish people and the Holocaust becomes the moral compass for the Western world that failed and was failing to address issues of justice in relation to the peoples that it was colonizing, continuing to colonize throughout the rest of the world. In this particular instance, we're referring to African people. Realizing the fact that European colonization was not exclusively done in relation to African people. For example, India was also colonized, but we're focusing on African people today. A good example of what I'm referring to is the issue of genocide and what is and is not considered genocide. The term genocide is a relatively recent terminology within the context of the English language and geopolitics. It was coined by a gentleman by the name of Raphael Lemkin, who is of the Jewish community, who, if I'm not mistaken, lived in Germany and basically was able to escape somewhere around the beginning of Mass European War II and or the Holocaust and make his way to America. And he wanted to develop a framework and a label for particular kinds of crimes that exist on a mass level and inflict and affect mass groups of people. And so he comes up with this terminology, genocide. Yes, genocide. And when he was defining the term genocide, one of the key aspects of genocide was what was called cultural genocide, which means destroying a people as a cultural group. This now is not limited to mass murder, rape, pillaging, and so on. It included things such as removing the names that are indigenous to that group. It included things such as creating a social structure whereby the culture of that group is unprivileged to the privilege of the colonial or the colonizer or the oppressor structure, to the extent that the practice and the capacity of those people to engage in and practice their own culture is diminished and therefore becomes extinguished. It included things like kidnapping the children or otherwise acquiring the children of said group and raising them in the context or the institutions of the oppressor, so as to assimilate the children of said group into the oppressor group against the interest of their people. It included all of those dynamics. But when you look at the definition of genocide today, those things are not included. And the reason why those things are not included is because when these things were being discussed at the United Nations as a part of establishing international law, many of the powers who were involved in the conversation were guilty of some of the crimes that were identified in the definition. And so there was a battle, and so we're talking about nations like Britain, nations like France, nations like Spain, Portugal, Belgium, nations like even Russia. Yes, we're all at the table discussing how genocide should be defined in international law. And so politically speaking, because almost all of these powers at this time were colonizer nations, they didn't want certain things to be included in the definition because they would be guilty of said crimes. What am I saying here? I'm saying that within the context of international law, what happened during this period was that the interest of what then was referred to as Jewish people in the context of the Zionist movement was pulled into the axis of Western imperialism. It becomes the defining factor for the moral superiority of the West in the world, and they deliberately defined atrocities committed upon African people outside of that framework. Understand what I say? Yeah? So we have a situation now in which Zionism draws the interest of many of the Jewish people into the Western imperialist project. Officially. This culminates in the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, which, as I said earlier, was founded based upon the displacement of people who were already living in that land, who are referred to as Palestinians. But in fact, the Zionist project has always been allied to the project of Western imperialism and colonialism, explicitly so. Yeah? We have evidence of this because the man who is considered the father of Zionism, the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, yes, in his book, The Jewish State, speaks explicitly about the fact that his company, and I'm forgetting the name of the company, yeah? Forgive me, I'm forgetting the name of the company, right? But it's listed in the book, yeah? But the Jewish something or another, yeah, would be run in a similar way as companies that facilitated British colonialism around the world, including in the African continent. There is a letter contained in the diary of Theodore Herzl that he had written to Cecil Rhodes. Yes? Cecil Rhodes, the notorious colonizer who massacred and committed genocide against African people, particularly in southern Africa. Theodore Herzl wrote to Cecil Rhodes saying explicitly that within the quest of Zionism, he has similar interests. Yes? And looking for the advice of Cecil Rhodes in terms of how to complete the Zionist project on behalf of his people. In, I believe it was 1903, that on the part of Theodore Herzl actually culminated in the suggestion of what is called the Uganda scheme, whereby it was possible that the state of Israel, what happened in Palestine in 1948, could have happened in Uganda, in East Africa, because Uganda was earmarked for a period of time and suggested to the British Empire, to the British, on behalf of the Zionists, to be the suggested area of land to impose the state of Israel on behalf of the Zionists. Yeah, the story for why it never happened is a very, very long one. But Britain, as a colonizer and the preeminent colonizer up until the end of mass European War II, was intimately tied into, yes, the Zionist project, because they were making promises with the Arabs, they were making promises with the Zionists, they were trying to break up the Ottoman Empire, and it's a very long story. What happened after mass European War II is that America replaced Britain as the preeminent colonizer in the world. And so America becomes the dominant force ensuring the establishment of the state of Israel in what is today, or what was then referred to as Palestine. And so it's very, very important as African people, we and understand the dynamics, yes, of that reality, and the fact that Western imperialism, being the dominant power structure in the world that dominates the lives, the economies and the nations of African people around the world, we have to understand where the Zionist project fits into that power relationship and that power dynamic. And I'm going to end on this particular point, bringing it right up to now. As I said earlier, the Western powers have given Israel the authority and the backing unconditionally to commit war crimes, even under its own definition of what war crimes are. By the Geneva Convention that they all signed up to, that they all impose upon the world, collective punishment is considered to be a war crime. Locking off electricity, denying the right of food and water to be transmitted to a nation is considered to be a war crime. And when you listen to British politicians today, none of them, some of them have been directly asked, is it a war crime for Israel to act in this way? The ways in which Israel has declared they are going to act and is in fact acting. And no politician, none of them, have declared that this is in fact a war crime. They have given effectively authority for Israel to commit the war crimes that they said they are going to commit. The British media and many of its media personnel begin the questioning about this issue on the subject of, do you condemn what Hamas has done? And one doesn't have to support Hamas to understand that this conflict doesn't begin with Hamas, and to understand and sympathize with the fact that atrocities have been committed against the people of Palestine from at least 1948 up until now. Hamas didn't exist in 1948. Yes? Hamas is in fact relatively late, yes, within the dynamics of what is taking place in that part of the world. And so we have to be very, very careful. There is no parity. We hear about Floyd Mayweather sending a private airplane, yes, with resources to Israel. Israel is a state which has one of the biggest militaries in the world, has arguably the most sophisticated intelligence service in the world, Mossad. is heavily supported by all of the biggest economies and the biggest militaries in the world. They are fighting against a people who do not have a nation to speak of, who do not have a standing army or military to speak of, who are severely under-resourced. 2 million people in Gaza, in a strip, living in what is considered to be an open-air prison. There is no parity in the dynamics of this conflict. And anybody who paints the illusion that there is either delusional or a liar. Yes? So where, by what designation and what inspiration does a black man in America feel the need to send, even a wealthy black man, send resources to a very, very well-resourced nation who are fighting against a people who don't even have a nation as far as a state is concerned to speak of? Why are we doing this? Where does that come from? It comes from the fact that we have been manipulated and cajoled and seduced into a sensibility of pledging our allegiance to Western nation states. And by doing so, we must meet the demands and the political interests of those nation states against even our own interests. Papa Garvey said, when two people are warring, hear all, but attend only to that which concerns you. When two potential enemies are warring, study the dynamics in order to get what is best for African people out of it. And so we should never be found loitering within the confines of other people's struggles. We should never expend more resources fighting other people's battles than we expend on our own. I want to know the extent to which our brothers and sisters like David Lammy and LeBron James and Floyd Mayweather have raised their voices against what is taking place in the Congo. Yes? And the British multinational corporations who are exploiting the people and the resources of the Congo. I want to know the extent to which our brothers and sisters have raised their voices and sent resources to the Niger Delta and demanded that Shell and BP and Chevron and ExxonMobil, who are exploiting the people and the ecology of the Niger Delta to this day, should be made guilty of crimes. Are we sending resources to our brothers and sisters in the Niger Delta to help them to withstand the crimes that are being committed against them? To what extent have our brothers and sisters sent resources to Haiti to withstand the continued American incursions into Haiti and the crimes that are being committed there? And even for our brothers and sisters who justly and rightly identify that there is an injustice that is being perpetrated against the people of Palestine. And we should be clear about that right about now, that there is an injustice being perpetrated against the people of Palestine. Ask your brothers and sisters, to what extent, when African people raise their voice on the issue of Palestine, to what extent is that replicated by Palestinians and Arabs and the rest of the Muslim world in relation to injustices that are being perpetrated on African people, including when those injustices are being perpetrated by Arabs and other people in the Muslim world? Ask those questions. Ask those questions, and let us centralize and organize around our own interests as African people. Before, know what our political interests are, and only from that perspective can we share meaningful solidarity with other people who are clearly suffering injustice in today's world. I hope all that I've said makes sense. I'm going to conclude it there. 10-9-1, be thankful unto the Mother, Father, creative life unto the universe. Because Zionism and give praises unto our great ancestors. Abibi Tumi, Abibi Fahodi, African power and African liberation for all African people. Ashe.